Hello, hello. Welcome back to Angular Nation. This is our experts channel. I'm very excited to see everybody tonight. Quick thank you to our sponsors, AG Grid. We love AG Grid and we appreciate your help. And yeah, tonight we have Alex Rickabaugh back. I'm so excited. And so Alex was here, I don't know, sometime in the spring or sometime last year talking about this standalone components, the spike. It was just kind of something you were playing with, and now it's out in V14. Everybody's excited. We're excited about a lot of things, but tonight we're super excited about standalone components, and we have basically lots of questions now. Like, we want to play with it and kind of talk more about it. So I've been bugging you, and now you're here. Thank you so much for coming, Alex Rickabaugh. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's
I love
this year
having
has
you.
just been a whirlwind, so I'm trying to get on here more often. But yeah, life has been kind of crazy lately.
Okay, so why don't we? I want to really open it up to Sonder, because Sonder and I were talking, and he was saying he had some questions. He knows he's seen some things that developers are struggling with, and I really thought that he hit the nail on the head. How do you feel, Sonder?
I should I give a quick intro of kind of standalone components and where we came from and
I
what's
think so. Yeah, because there are probably people here, and might be people who are watching the recording later who did not see the spike. So yeah, good
yeah,
call.
absolutely. Um, so I think if I ask the question at a conference or something like, what is the most loved and hated feature of Angular? I'd be willing to bet that I don't know if it's top one, but I'd be willing to bet NG modules are in the top three. It tends to be one of the first kind of friction points that a new developer who's never done any Angular has when they come to learn the framework. They encounter this concept, and it takes some time to kind of get your head around what this is and why you have to write them. And that's because that their NG modules are doing multiple jobs under the hood, and they're actually kind of quite complicated. Even though when you actually get it and you start using them in an application, it becomes a little bit more intuitive. You kind of understand, like, oh yeah, I want to use the router. I need the router module. I want to use NGRX. NGRX probably has an NG module for me to depend on. And so a while back, we've had on the roadmap for a long time, like explore a future where NG modules are optional. And a while back, probably more than a year ago, we started kicking off some serious discussions on like, what would this look like from a technical perspective? And we went through a couple of months of discussion. The result of that was I produced a spike that got kind of instantly noticed by the community, showing this early concept of like marking a component as standalone and having the component declare its own dependencies instead of participating in the NG module ecosystem. And that implementation was kind of intended to focus discussion around a particular example of how this could be done. It ended up being the wrong one. We closed the PR for a reason. We discovered some kind of really important things, nuances that we were missing. And so we shut that down. We went back to kind of discussions and drawing boards. And the result was what we actually took to RFC, which is the standalone components proposal. So that kind of answered all of the problems that the initial spike had. We took it through RFC. We got some great feedback from the community, changed a couple of things about how it worked. And the result was in version 14, we shipped standalone components, this kind of core foundational piece of this project. And I guess the point I want to make the most here is that this is a stepping stone. Standalone components themselves were not necessarily the goal, right? Having this feature. The goal was to make it easier to learn Angular. And our kind of guiding principle is that a new developer should be able to come to the framework and go through the Angular IO Tour of Heroes and not have to write at ng module anything until they get to a point where they're far enough along in the learning journey that like they might need to do this. So to kind of really delay the moment where you have to understand the deep internals of ng modules. You might use ng modules, you might still import material that way, But you shouldn't have to know how to write them in order to get started using Angular. And so that's really where we're trying to go. And there's more work coming down the pipeline in that direction.
Also, wouldn't standalone components make it possible to optimize the compiler further than it is possible now?
A little bit, yeah. So one of the main jobs the compiler does today is essentially, I describe it as like, it converts your ng module components into standalone components under the hood, which is the compiler looks at your application, it looks at your ng modules, figures out where everything is in a template, and then it compiles the component as if you wrote it as a standalone component to begin with. And so there's a kind of a chunk of work that the compiler has to do that it doesn't need to do for standalone components because you already told it directly what the dependencies are. And that has some, it's not a very like performance critical piece of the compiler. The time we spend analyzing your code is almost like insignificant compared to the time TypeScript takes to process files and everything. The entire Angular compiler, I think, is an overhead of about 10% on top of a normal TypeScript build. The real, I think, potential for improvement there is ng modules make the incremental build story really complicated, and we can get a lot of simplification out of that. So it does improve things in the compiler, but probably not in a way that you as an end user will notice very much.
Well, I hope that the compiler will go to a TypeScript plugin instead of on top of TypeScript.
It's possible, yeah. We still need kind of analysis for a couple of other things, where I don't think we can be a pure transformer just yet, but getting closer. Danny asks, can we get a definition of when we need ng modules? I hope that the answer to that question is at some point never. There are certain things that ng modules give you that you will have to do in different ways with standalone, that there's not kind of exact analogs for. One of the main things that ng modules do is bundle providers and components together. And that is a case where like they're just going to be separate things in the standalone world. I think ng upgrade is something we're looking at and saying like, well, maybe ng upgrade applications won't have a standalone alternative. That if you're coming in from AngularJS and trying to upgrade an AngularJS app, ng modules will be a stepping stone on that path. We're not doing a whole lot of work in upgrade these days because AngularJS itself is end of life. So there's not a whole lot changing there.
I think you can do an ng upgrade without modules though.
I think you'd still need them to upgrade or to use upgraded components.
You can do that in the app component. I've done it in the app component without the whole module dance that you usually do before. You can go without the module dance you do before. It's a little bit curious to see. It's a little bit hacky though.
Okay.
Are the standalone components going to be the recommendation going forward? If you're creating a new component, just do it standalone.
That is certainly the intention. As always, kind of subject to feedback that we get. So if the community starts picking up standalone components and we realize that like, yeah, they're just fundamentally broken for certain use cases, then we'll have to kind of reevaluate that. But the intention is that, yeah, eventually the Angular style guide will update to say that standalone components are the default.
Okay. And when you do your ng generate component, it'll be standalone by default.
Yep.
Yep. It's interesting. Do you want to think about services when you could provide them in root? Once that came out, like I find it hard to find a service that's provided in a module now. I think there are some use cases, like if you're doing, if you have like an interface for a service, that kind of thing, but it's kind of rare, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I have a question on this later on. I can basically do it now because in the new setup, you can provide using the router, which is, I think, the best way to go if you need something like that. The router is usually bundling the futures together, so it's the most logical place to do this. But I had a question around this anyway, so I think we can hand this to Alex and explain how this would go to router provided things instead of ng module provided things.
Yeah, and actually we can talk about kind of the larger context of dependency injection.
Yeah.
So one of the new APIs that was introduced in the kind of RFC for things around standalone, because
I just linked that in the chat.
Yeah, perfect. It's not enough to have standalone components in Angular. They need to actually fit into the rest of the framework and feel like they're first-class citizens. And so we wanted to ensure that it was possible to do the kinds of things you could do with ng modules without needing to use ng modules. Part of the goal of like simplifying the learning journey so that you don't have to touch ng modules until you're ready to. And one of the things is to provide services in lazily loaded routes. So when you do lazy loading in the router today, you do it by loading an ng module, and you're able to provide services in the ng module. And for a long time, that was the only way to lazy load services in Angular, was to have them in a lazy load module that gets loaded and the services are loaded with it. A while back, we introduced this concept of provided in root, where we kind of decoupled the scope of a service in dependency injection, where it's available to be injected, from when it gets loaded. And so the nice thing with a provided in root service is you don't have to include it in ng module providers. It's there somewhat implicitly. And that means you can lazy load it later with a component and then inject it, and it behaves as if it was in the injector there all along. So that kind of reduced, but didn't eliminate the need for configuring providers specific to lazy loaded routes. So to make sure we had parity there, we decided to introduce the ability to have providers on a route. So instead of passing in an ng module, which has providers, you just pass the providers directly. And we went kind of a step further than lazy loading and said, well, it doesn't really make sense that like having providers scope to a route only works if the route is lazily loaded. That's kind of a quirk of how the old design worked, that these are actually kind of separate things. Lazy loading a component should be separate from the providers that are exposed to that component on the route. And so we said, let's just make the providers field work for any route, not just lazy loaded routes. And so the router, has always known how to do this, right? Anytime you lazy load an ng module route, you're creating an injector that has providers and using that injector to kind of service the route. The router has always had this capability, but now we've just exposed it directly as take a set of providers for any route. And this is in line with kind of a larger plan we have for dependency injection, which is to start in our APIs catering more towards, I want to provide things in a given context and step back from having parameters that just take injector. So instead of you being responsible for creating an injector and passing it in certain cases, like view container ref, for example, we want to start moving towards like, you just give us the providers and we'll fit that into an injection hierarchy that makes sense for the application. And that comes out of, we've seen a lot of confusion for people who are creating injectors that don't have the right parents or have, parents in multiple locations or things like that. Kind of mixing the module and element injector hierarchies, which is a hard thing to even wrap your head around if you're working on the framework, let alone as a user who doesn't really understand what you're getting when you inject injector. So we're trying to make those APIs a lot less of a foot gun by saying that what you really want to do is add providers to a route, right? And you give us the providers and we'll take care of creating the injector hierarchy that makes sense for that location.
If you get to a point where you can share your screen and kind of Because you do this thing where you're kind of typing while you're talking at the same time and be like, "This it is so exciting." Just saying, don't forget. It's my favorite part.
We can do that.
Because it helps a lot, I think, to stick it in our brain. If we could say, what does that look like? Not exactly like the actual code, but just, you did this thing when you were talking to me and you were talking about something and you shared your screen, and it just helped me a lot.
So in my application, right, I have some routes. I have a home route. Let's say components as home components. And like I have my admin route. And so one of the new APIs that Sander is talking about is for a given route, we've added the ability to pass in providers. And so I can say here that like, I want to provide maybe my auth service, right? With admin auth service. And so this component, that's the component for this route, and everything under it will have access to this set of providers here. Whereas anything else in the application won't. So we have providers now that are scoped to a given route. Kai.
I think you just answered my question, that they are tied to the route. I was wondering about the life cycle of this service, if it's bound to a specific route. Before an ng module, if you provide something or provide it in root, then it's basically a singleton kind of, or you could attach a service to a component and then it had the same life cycle as the component life cycle. But is it, if you tie this provider now to a route, then if you route back to the other route, then this service is destroyed, or is it still alive?
Great question. Currently, it is still alive.
Okay. Okay,
So
didn't expect that actually.
Yeah, the injector for a route is initialized when you first navigate to the route. So those services will be, available at that point. But it's never.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that really makes sense, because if you are routing to that route, you go back to somewhere else and you go back again to that same route. You expect things to still be there.
Yeah. So imagine if I added my NGRX store here, right? Which I had some state that I wanted to track, and when I navigate to this route, I'd make some actions in the components that update that state. And then I navigate away and come back. I kind of expect that the store that I put there doesn't reset itself.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that it has, it continues to persist the state that I acted on to get there. There is a long-standing feature request in the router to be able to destroy these injectors. Even before we have this API, right, you could still lazily load an ng module, and that would kind of stick around forever. So that's probably something we will do at some point, is have an ability to kind of ask the router to reset a certain route's
Isn't that just providing this service inside of the component instead of in the route? Because those will be destroyed as the component gets destroyed?
Very possible to set it up that way. It's slightly different because I can do this. I can have a route that has children, but no component.
Yeah.
I can have several components in here that are all sharing the same providers, right?
Yeah, true. But if you want to have this separation, you can just put a nearly empty component in there and put the providers in there. And then they will be destroyed along with the route.
Yes. If you want the behavior of them being the services being tied to the loading of the route, right, and being on that route, and not just singletons in the application space. Maybe you want something in between, right? Maybe you when you log out of your application, you want to tell the Angular router, hey, go and clear all the state that you had stored in these shared services. And you could do that pretty automatically by just saying hey, destroy all the injectors on this route. So we will probably have some kind of API like that in the future.
That will be useful, though.
Yeah.
It makes things easier.
I start right away if I may. If from a library perspective, if I now export standalone components, I assume they don't work in Angular 12, or do they work in Angular 12? And I have a follow-up question, actually.
Yeah, they do not work in Angular 12.
Okay. And I expect
in Angular 13.
Sorry, yeah, we had 14.
Yeah.
Alex, do you know who Kai Roeder is?
Yeah, we've met before.
Oh, okay, cool. For anybody who doesn't know who Kai Roeder is, he's working a lot on storybooks, so that's why he's asking good questions.
And if you create standalone components and import them in an ng module, could you use this ng module in Angular 13?
That's a great question. I think the answer is still no. So what you're talking about is actually called forwards compatibility.
Yes.
As opposed to backwards compatibility, which is like, can I use a Angular 12 library in Angular 14?
Yes.
Forwards compatibility is, can I use an Angular 14 library in Angular 12? And the answer is no. There are special runtime considerations for how to render standalone components, and nothing short of Angular 14 knows how to do that.
Okay.
It's always kind of an interesting, like this came up in a GitHub issue recently too. It's always kind of an interesting thought experiment to go through, because like if you think about it, in Angular version 14.1, we could introduce something like a new mode of view encapsulation, right? And only the 14.1 runtime would know how to work with that. And so it means that if a library updates to 14.1, really it should only be usable by Angular applications that are also on 14.1 or above. So whereas backwards compatibility, we try to do 2 major versions, forwards compatibility doesn't even theoretically work across minors. It's a much stronger constraint. In practice, we try not to be that harsh about things. We very easily could enforce this in code, right? That like a component knows what version of Angular it was compiled with, and so it could just refuse to run on a runtime that's not at least that. But we try to kind of take a more practical approach to only breaking this forwards compatibility when it makes sense to. And standalone was one case where we kind of had to.
Kai always asks the best questions.
Welcome, Bao. Welcome to the party.
I think it is interesting for the people to see how you can lazy load routes with the new setup.
Yeah. So let's just use this example here. So I have this constant routes that I'm exporting. And the old way to do this, right, is I would have to write an ng module. It was like my lazy module. And here I would import the router module for child and pass my routes token here, right? And I was supposed to, but I, nothing enforced this, that I actually properly declare the components that are actually my route components. And then in the router module, in the application, right, you would say like router module for root. And here I'd say, for this route, like lazy, I want to load children. And this is a function that's going to import my lazy file, lazy.module. and then get this lazy ng module. And so what we've done for standalone is kind of cut out the middleman almost. Middleman being this ng module. So if you export this routes token directly, what you can actually do is get rid of the ng module and just load the routes instead. So you can load child routes without needing to kind of wrap it in an ng module and injector and all of that. And it's a little bit less boilerplate and even more efficient.
I would really love if you would use
Yeah.
the default exports.
So there is a discussion right now on if you have export default const thing, instead of having to have this .then where we navigate from kind of the module that you imported, ES module, not ng module, the module that you imported to the routes token, we can recognize that like, oh, it's just going to be the .default. And so we can make this load children just collapse to import the lazy thing.
Yeah, and you can check the type of the import and just throw if it's not a route.
Yeah, basically.
I would really love this. I know some people say it's way too magic, but I think it just makes sense. It also makes it so much easier to refactor and move things around a little bit. And people are always, yeah, but it is not explicit enough. I think export default is pretty explicit by itself, but that might just be me.
Yeah, I also kind of favor this approach. And I think as long as we have, either an option to turn it off or like people can use a lint roll if they don't want to, if they don't want this in their code base, then that's fine.
Yeah.
But I syntactically, this makes a lot of sense to me that this is just like.
Yeah, and you can still export a named route. You can have you can have it both ways if you prefer it.
Yeah.
You can do export default const my routes, which is just fine.
Yep.
Alex, I know you said the intention was that hopefully never I had to use ng modules.
Mm-hmm.
But is that the future intention is that we'll never see ng modules again? So we never use it no matter how we scale our project? And would there be any advantage then to using ng modules?
Oh, I love these questions. My hope is that you would never have to use ng modules. There may still be cases in which ng modules are a natural fit for how you want to architect an application. A great example of this is like the shared module pattern that people use, right? Where they just like, I want a bunch of components that all share the same bucket of dependencies. You can do that with standalone, but it might be a bit repetitive. It's kind of more natural to do that with an ng module. And that may be a pattern where like you still want to reach for ng modules instead of using standalone.
Why?
Right.
Can you explain why you think it's more repetitive? Because you can just export an array of the things you want to reuse?
Sometimes, yeah. So let's actually get into that. So what I'm envisioning is like, certainly if you have Sonder external shared dependencies, right? Where I just say like, my depths are, mat button module, mat input module, 30 things from material, right? And if I want to write 3 components, like I can just do this. Component A, component B. So this is not particularly repetitive, right? Even though I have some big set of dependencies that are shared between these components, I can just share them between these components with any other kind of data in JavaScript, right?
Yeah.
Where it gets interesting is if I have some set of components, let's add a third one here, where like component C here wants to use component A in its template, and maybe component B. Component B wants to use component A, component A wants to use component C, maybe component B as well. So when you have this kind of tangled web of components, and a great example of this is like a table rendering thing where it's like deeply hierarchical and nested. This is possible with standalone. You end up doing things like, okay, I need to import the forward ref to component C here, right? Because this is actually a circular reference. C depends on A depends on C, and so I have to care about the order in which they're declared, and I have to like express to JavaScript that I want this reference to be lazy. This is a case where maybe an ng module just makes more sense because I can put these 3 declarations in an ng module and it just does it for me.
I would probably kick the dev that wants to put something like this in my project. I will physically go to him and kick his ass.
Sander, behave yourself. I told you to be careful of those Dutch guys tonight.
Yeah, there are other philosophies. But this case does come up in real components, right? Like if you have a tree view that wants to render like nested nodes, you are going to have circular references between those nodes. Full stop. And it's more work to express that in the standalone system than it is ng module.
But wouldn't it be good to have it expressed though?
I personally feel that way. That like if you have this in your code, it's better to have it be visible. The Angular compiler does unspeakable things under the hood to make this work when you just have template references. It has a de-optimization in it that will break tree shaking to make circular components work without introducing import cycles and having to care about forward reps.
So technically this is better than ng modules.
This is certainly like the value of that explicitness is something that can be debated, right? But for me, it is certainly better than ng modules. But I will readily accept that, like, from an authoring experience, this kind of sucks.
Yeah.
Right. It's really annoying to have to care about forward rep.
Though it makes it explicit, so at least you know there is something finicky going on there, which is hidden away by ng modules. And I'm not sure if it's like a...
Yep, exactly.
So if you don't allow Angular to do it under the hood and you don't have the forward ref, would you get an error of circular reference?
So what will happen, right, is presumably either you have these things in the... Yeah, I think in this case, like TypeScript may give you an error, right? Like TypeScript here may yell at you and say that like you're using this before it's declared. I think that's actually what happens. But if you have these things in multiple files, right, then somewhere I've done import component C from component C, and this is in like component A.ts. And I've done the opposite, right, in component C.ts. So I have circular imports. And the way this works in the browser, right, because this does get compiled down to JavaScript executed in the browser, is the browser sees this import and follows it to this file. It sees this import when it's starting to execute the imported file and realizes that it would have to go and do a cycle. And so instead of that, what it does is it sets component A to undefined. It runs the rest of the component A or component C file. And then it updates the value of component A at the end once it has resolved once it's back in the original file. And that is where you can end up with very strange runtime errors where you're like, undefined dot whatever is not a function because you created a circular import that made it to runtime, and you have this weird like partial.
Yeah, and it will become even more joyful if you change the order and then it breaks, and then you
Yes.
put the order back and then it works, and you go like. So
And this is why the Angular compiler actually does like it's de-optimization under the hood when you have template cycles. It's not because we don't know how to generate forward ref calls. That would be completely fine. But we have no guarantee that we're not going to break an import that you depended on by generating our own and creating a cycle, right? We don't know if we're going to be first in this list, and then your import is going to execute and be undefined for a while, where you didn't expect it to. And so we have to kind of handle this very carefully, not because we can't create forward references, but we don't know if you expected there to be a forward reference there.
okay, I think the next one you have to show is how to use for child without modules.
Sure. Which for child are we talking about?
Route for child.
Yeah.
Route module for child.
Yeah. Well,
Because-
we kind
Yeah,
of
we
went
kind of
through
did
this.
it, but I want to have it explicit because that is something that people ask, like, how do I do a route for child without modules?
Yeah. So as mentioned before, right, the way you had to set up this route is I had my ng module with a lazily loaded that's intended to be lazily loaded, right? Lazy module. And here I had to say router module dot for child and pass in like my array of routes, right? Which could be this routes token that we declared. So for the, all for child really is a helper function to provide something. That's what these for root, for child, etc. There's no special meaning to the name other than kind of how it's supposed to be used. All this is actually doing is providing routes. So we have just made the router not need router module for child to get routes. Instead, you can just reference the routes directly.
Yeah, this is actually a question I got a couple of times and I had to think about it.
Yeah.
Basically, the answer is you don't need it anymore. It's taken care of automatically. Well, not automatically. The whole magic is gone. It's now, I think, more explicit even.
Yeah. What's a good example of this? Yeah, so let's say we have some library, right? And this library says we have a function called, like, let's use ngrx store, right? For a feature. So this thing is designed to be imported into an eng module. It's how you configure features in your ngrx store. I'm not an ngrx user, so I can't give a more detailed example than ... But so the way you would typically do this, right, is if I had my lazy loaded route module, I would say, oh, I'm going to define my routes, but also like I know that I'm going to need for a feature of this ... feature that I'm building. I know that I'm going to need that in these routes, so I'm going to import it into my lazy loaded router module. If I don't have an ng module, okay, I know how to load routes, right? I can just load them directly. What the heck do I do for feature here? Where does this guy live, right? If the ng module goes away. So the answer there is kind of why we created this extra providers field for the router. So here are the routes that I want to load. And I know that I want all of these routes to have access to this for feature thing. And so what I actually do is I create this kind of like empty parent route. With all of my other routes in it. And so I just have some container route that like everything is logically within. And here I can say, well, I'm going to have some providers. I want to provide some things to every route that I'm lazily loading in this routes token. And one of the things I'm going to provide is this utility function import providers from. And here is where I can put my router module or NGRX store for feature. So we have this import providers from, which is a bridge from the ng module world into the ng module less world of just dealing with providers directly. So this is the way I can say, oh yes, what I used to do was set up a lazy loaded ng module that had all of my 4 childs and my 4 features, etc. Now I just import them directly into the providers of the route that I'm loading. So we're setting up exactly the same structure that we had before, which is lazily load a bunch of routes in an ng module that has some providers associated with it. We're just doing it very directly by providing some routes, and the routes are contained in a parent route that has a bunch of providers. Questions? Is this clear? Clear as mud?
I know that I'm going to ask you if we can have the link to your notes because.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Oh, right. You. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Go for it, Kai.
Go ahead, Tito.
No, I had a
sorry.
different question. I had a different topic. So
Okay. Yeah. I was like it's kind of strange to me, like you having providers and providers, like it's like next in providers and providers, not like yeah, kind of wrapping my head about that. It's kind of
Yeah, and I think the thing to realize is like this is not a provider, right? This is like something that you would put in ng module imports. This NGRX store 4 feature. So you need to convert it to providers in order to put it in the import of providers field.
okay.
Probably an updated version of NGRX will provide a proper provider for this. So you can have like a 4 feature provider in NGRX. So you can just use a normal provider instead of using the import provider from thing.
And do you know, Alex, if the docs have been updated for this yet?
For you mean the Angular docs or the NGRX docs?
No, the Angular docs for this.
The Angular docs, no. So the Angular standalone.
Then we really want your notes.
Yeah, standalone components right now are in a concept we call developer preview, which is just a way of saying like we want to make sure that these APIs are working the way we intended before we say they're stable and commit to not changing them. So all of the standalone documentation is in one standalone guide. So we have a guide for getting started with standalone. And it does have examples on how to provide things to routes and how to use import providers from and all of that. But it's contained within the standalone guide, not a part of like the router docs or the,
It's on the update to standalone components in the Angular blog.
It would be this guide here.
Thank you.
So here's a discussion of how to lazy load, similar example to mine, right? Like export routes as a const and load them together. How to provide things to a subset of routes. How to combine providers and load children. So these are kind of the examples that we walk through.
Perfect.
I don't think it shows specifically the import providers from, but that's. Oh yeah, we do have that example. Okay, nice.
Okay, we have more hands up, and I think Danny's up next.
For an existing project already using NG modules, would it be a good idea to make a new feature with standalone components? Or would this create more hassle than help?
No, absolutely go for it.
Okay. So could I use the existing, if I have a shared module, I would create a different shared module to use for the standalone components, right?
If you want.
You can just import your shared module. No problem.
All right.
You have the new feature component, right? If I make this standalone, I can import, old shared module. That's fine. I would suggest attempting to decompose this into dependencies the component actually uses. Just because I think like one of the main benefits of standalone is it allows you to be more kind of granular about your dependencies, and I think that's good. But nothing stops you from using the old shared module if that's really like the set of things you want to depend on.
Right. All right. So there's no reason to wait to use standalone. It's just to put it everywhere now because it's going to change anyways, and maybe slowly refactor NG modules away from existing projects as well.
Yeah, it's up to you.
Right.
I do think like, assuming that we don't find any major flaws with the standalone design, which at this point is it's been tested pretty heavily. It will become at some point the default style guide recommendation for new Angular applications, at least should be written in standalone style.
Right. Cool. Thanks.
Even though it's in developer preview, you're saying just go ahead.
We've previewed it.
Go for it.
Let's
yeah.
go.
All right.
Everybody loves it.
Yeah. So an example of developer preview, right? And this is a little bit in the weeds of details, but Angular has two dependency injection hierarchies, right? You have the component hierarchy, which we call the element injectors, and then outside of that, you have the application hierarchy, which we used to call module injectors. And as part of developing the standalone suite of APIs, we had to rename that because there were no NG modules involved, and that would have been terribly confusing. And so now we call them environment injectors. And we have this function to create an environment injector, which again is going from like, I want to basically add a list of providers on top of some existing structure in the application. You typically wouldn't interact with this function as an end user very much. But one of the things that it did was it had a parent. Parent with environment injector. And when we released 4.0.0, it accepted a null parent. So you could create an environment injector that did not have a parent. And we kind of didn't fully realize the implications of this, I guess. So one of the goals was to have environment injectors should always be logically a child of something that is a root scope. So that has all the provided in root services. One of the problems you could get yourself into is like, in Angular, using the APIs today, I can render a component with an injector that doesn't actually have like Angular's core services, like ng zone or the rendering or shared styles or any of that. Because those things are all provided in root, and I could create an injector that doesn't have access to provided in root things. And so we wanted to make the environment injector kind of always require a parent so that it was guaranteed to roll up to something which has all of Angular services in it. So in a recent change, actually, we just removed the null option. You have to provide a parent when creating an environment injector. And that is a change that we would not have been able to do normally because we would have to, like, this would be a breaking change. We'd have to deprecate the old signature, wait for 2 major versions, right? Our commitment to stability means that these things change very slowly. We'd probably have a migration or something like that. But because this was a developer preview API, we just removed it in 14.1. Because developer preview means that, like, things may change a little bit faster than they normally would.
But it's looking like the developer preview on standalone components is going to move forward.
My hope is that in 15 we'll be able to stabilize the API. We'll see if we get there.
It does seem like the feedback's been overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah, we have a list of things that we consider important to stabilization. Mainly that we know we're not going to need to change the APIs very much in the future. And to know that, we have to know we can support kind of all existing use cases. So one of these things, for example, is Angular Elements. Right now, Elements kind of requires you to use an ng module because of the way you bootstrap it. But we want to have standalone Angular Elements. And we have a design for that. So there's a short list of these things that are kind of blocking stabilization at the moment. So
there is a way for elements to be created without an ng module, which is tiny hacky again, but just create them in your app component instead of your module and use the injector from the app component, which is more or less the root injector anyway.
Yeah.
Technically not entirely correct, but for practical purposes.
I mean, today, right, you can always inject environment injector, which is the root injector in an app component.
Yeah.
Kind of a modern thing.
Yakima?
Next.
Hi, so I have a question regarding providers. If you can please scroll up where you have routes. Yes. Yes, here, for example, you have for path admin, you are providing out service. Just to understand when to provide service here in routes rather than, for example, in admin component. I would expect, for example, in admin component to have the out service. We should provide them in routes if we want them to persist between navigations, or there is some other reason, because if I provide out service in admin component, it would be anywhere shared with its subcomponents.
Yeah, more or less exactly that. So the advice I usually give people is provide things in root unless you have a specific need for their life cycle to be different. So root is just, it's a singleton. It exists kind of ambiently in the application. You can use it anywhere. It never gets destroyed. If you have a specific need to do something else, to have the service behave differently, then you can provide it somewhere else. So in the route, for example, the service is scoped only to those components that are inside that route. If that behavior is important, then that's when you would provide it in the route versus provide it in root. If you want the service to be destroyed when the route is destroyed, that's when you provide it in the component.
Okay, thank you very much.
Make sense?
Yes.
Perfect.
Ronan.
Hey, this kind of is a follow-up from Danny's question. So, like, if I have so many modules, and I just kind of want to go in and just change them all to standalone components. But like, what is the main benefit? And are there any like gotchas or tips? I know you mentioned having the explicit dependencies is one benefit, but is there anything else? Like, if I wanted to justify doing this work, what are the main benefits?
I find, yeah, it's a little bit nuanced, but the nice thing about standalone components, having worked with them for a little bit, one, it's just a lot less boilerplate to write. Not having to write an ng module is really nice. The second nice aspect of it is it's very easy to navigate in code from a component to its dependencies, and to just look at the component class itself, even just the decorator, and see like, okay, what's used here. Whereas if you're using ng modules, it becomes a question of like, okay, where is this component declared? Well, I have to go search the rest of the code base, right? Find references on the component, filter through that, find the ng module that's declaring it. You know, in an application of 5 components, not a problem. In an application with 500 components, like moving around the code base is a lot easier with standalone. Understanding what's used where is a lot easier with standalone.
Okay, that makes sense. Especially, I've seen some apps where I go in and giant apps have like one module. That's one thing
Yeah.
I've noticed, especially if people don't really understand Angular modules. So you could then do it component by component and slowly understand the actual dependencies that are being used.
Exactly. It's just, if you're a developer working in a code base that you don't like have in your head the whole time, standalone is far easier to follow.
Okay, performance-wise, there's no benefit.
No difference. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Like I said, the Angular compilers, one of its main jobs is rewriting ng modules to make components standalone, you know, at runtime anyway. So the runtime output is not that different.
Cool. Gotcha.
Okay, I hate to ask this question because I'm having so much fun, but I just want to check in because we're at top of the hour. Alex, we have a couple more hands coming up, but I want to check in with you and respect your time because I know that you're busy. How are we doing? Do you have time for more questions? Yeah?
Yeah, no trouble.
Let's go. Okay, Sonder.
Well, yeah, I was actually expecting to be the last question. So my question would be like, first, thank you, Alex, for your time. And the question was, what do you think will be a major stumbling block for people coming from ng modules wanting to adapt standalone?
Yeah. The process of taking an existing standalone component or existing ng module component and making it standalone requires some thought. It's not always the most obvious how to do this. And that's because kind of ng modules right now are a mixed bag. Some of the things, like app module is a great example of this, right? Many of the things in your application module are not related to the app component itself. You import the router module, right? Router module for route in app module. It's configuring the router in your application. It's not actually configuring the app component very much. So when you go to say, like, I want to make my app component standalone, and I want to take this big list of imports in my app module and figure out which things are conceptually dependencies of the app component versus which things are like configuration for the application that I'm bootstrapping, standalone requires you to kind of separate these two lists. And that requires a little bit of knowledge as you go through each module. It's like, what should I do with this one? Which, you know, where does it go? This is actually one of the main challenges to creating a like migration, like a CLI command that you can run to migrate a component or an entire application to standalone. Is Angular itself actually doesn't know this. We can tell you exactly what your app component dependencies are, but we can't tell you like what is theoretically important to your app component versus your application.
Yeah.
Especially true if I have like a great example of this, right? Is if I have my component, call this like, you know, old component or whatever, and it has an ng module, and the ng module says declarations, old component, imports. So I'm using common module, HTTP client module, and router module, right? If we want to make this standalone, we need to write an imports list here. And we probably want to like decompose this list. And so common module, great. We know how to do that. Router module, you're using router link or something, cool. You don't actually put HTTP client module here, right? That's a bad idea. And that's because this is actually not contributing at all to the template of this component. Right? You're expecting HTTP to be a service that's available to you. That's something you should configure at the application level. So somewhere in my Bootstrap, I'm using the new fancy Bootstrap application, right? I think it's providers or something like that.
Yeah, I still have to look this up every time.
Yeah. Here I want to say, well, let's load HTTP client module, right? Because this ng module was doing two jobs before. It was configuring the template for this component, providing its dependencies in the form of common module, router module, etc. But it was also configuring the application to be ready to use this component by saying, I want HTTP installed at the application level. And so that's kind of one of the main differences with standalone is we're very explicit about what is a template dependency that goes in component imports and what is a like dependency injection requirement. And that goes in the application providers. So no longer do you use ng modules to kind of carry both of those things at once. If you can grasp that, you'll be much more effective at migrating existing components to standalone.
This is such a good discussion because it's really, you can't get all of this from the page of the docs. Like it's so much more helpful to actually just ask these questions and then you just show us what the code is. So this is so cool. Okay, Mikkel.
Right. This is actually a nice example of what I wanted to ask. So in your Bootstrap application, I mean, common module you almost always want to use in your components, right? Do you always have to import it, or can you also import it like import providers from in your Bootstrap application? Would that be possible?
Right. Oh God, that's a great question. So I was talking about here, right? This like HTTP client module is kind of fundamentally different than the other two. Right?
Yeah.
This is configuring services. These are configuring template dependencies. Right? This is like we want router outlet, right? Or router.
Sure.
Common module is ngIf, ng4, etc.
Yeah, the router module is also providing a couple of services though, so there is some ambiguity here.
Somewhat.
I mean, I know there were some discussions about common module being like a magic import always for standalone because you kind of always need it anyway in your templates. Do you always have to import it like this?
I don't think router module has any services. I think that's only the for root call gets you the router services. So yeah, so the question is like, what should I import here versus what should I import here? Yes, you always have to import common module. It's not an automatic thing. We decided in the RFC that like explicitness was probably better. But we did decide like, if you don't want to depend on common module, you can directly import ngIf, ng4 of, etc. So the directives and pipes became standalone and common module, or at least they will. One of the items on the list for stabilization. And do I need to import providers from common module here, right? What does this do?
Yeah.
So this call only gets providers from the module and puts them in the application.
Of course.
In this case, I kind of know that it's not necessary because common module doesn't have any providers.
Okay.
We've made them all provided in root. But as a developer, like looking at a third-party module, you may not know, right? Does it have providers or not? And so, like, very often you may have to import it just defensively, just in case it happens to be bringing something that you need. And this is one of the challenges with migrating to standalone, is now like this thing that used to do 2 jobs, you now do those 2 jobs separately, configure application providers, configure templates. And sometimes you don't know which of those 2 was important.
Okay. Alex, I have a follow-up question here.
Yeah.
If I have a third party that has like providers in there, and they have also like components in there I can use. When the components injects the provider, it gets provided in root, so I don't need to add it to the providers, to this import providers from thing, right?
If the service that's being injected is provided in root, then it will just be available. Doesn't need to be explicitly configured.
Yeah. So only if you have like a module that has like implicit provided things for that module only, then you need. So
a good example right now is Forms module. Forms module provides form builder, I believe, if you want to inject form builder. And so that needs to be in your import providers from in order to use form builder. We'll probably fix that, but for now, that is the case.
So as a follow-up on that, Alex, will it be possible eventually to just use barrel files only to organize code? I mean, I actually like ng modules, right? Code organization wise, I mean, I know you can do it with like an array of stuff, and you can just spread the array in imports, but will we eventually be able to just use standard barrels, exported barrels?
In terms of like, so I write something like this, right? I have like barrel.ts, and I say, export component A from file.
Yeah.
I export a couple of things, and then in my like component, I do at component standalone imports, import depths from
Start
like
this. Yeah, exactly. Okay.
It's an interesting idea. I think this is like, you could do this pretty easily today.
And then export the array, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then this would work.
That would definitely work, right? But just, I mean, that's not a standard barrel anymore, because you need the export default.
You need the array, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we would probably keep it as the array, but you could also do this. You could make your own barrel function that like converts from to array, and as long as it was understandable by the Angular compiler, that could work.
Sure.
I don't know if it's possible to write this today.
Okay, fair enough.
But yeah.
Will you put it back where it was so we
object
can?
entries will work on a module?
Sorry?
If object entries would work on a module, it would be easy to write a function like that.
I mean, we could very easily support that form. There's a question of like, is that a good style or not?
Well, I know I have a lot of existing barrel files in my module-based applications, right?
Yeah.
So it would be nice to not having to export specifically that array also, or have to change them all.
That's a good idea.
I actually like the idea also, and I will tell you why. Because this is how we are using barrels in all other and Node applications.
Yep.
And we can now use barrels also for Angular, but we have to do this array trick, which is like strange. Not from the Angular viewpoint, but from the viewpoint of how you normally use barrels.
Yeah.
So I would like if Angular would know how to handle a barreled file.
I could do a feature request.
It's worth considering. One of the challenges there is it's not just barrels, right? Nothing identifies a barrel
That's true.
specifically. So you would end up supporting like any object with keys, with named keys and classes, which people could get a little weird with that.
They can get weird with everything.
Yeah.
Remember, they're going to break it, Miguel. If you enable that, there are people out there who are going to be crazy with it.
I'm sure, but yeah, still.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an existing concept, right?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Good feedback for sure. Okay.
And I love the potential of the entire standalone idea. It's great. I can't wait to build something big with it.
It loves you too, Mikkel.
Thanks.
Yeah, I've worked on other things on Angular, little changes here and there, not related to standalone, but it's, when you write tests for things, you write standalone components in your tests because they're there. And everyone who's done that on the team has just been like, oh, this is so amazing. It's just so much easier to write these things.
Yeah, they feel a little bit more like web components, kind of self-contained,
Yeah. Pavel.
Thank you. I would like to ask you about when you were showing up there the examples. It was like page components for routing, yeah. Do you have somehow the way showing the functional component, like only the part of the page? I mean, like if I have the one page for component and I want to implement the only table, for example, of standalone component, is that possible?
I'm not entirely sure I follow. So let's.
Yeah. You will have the page, like page component only, which imports the table component, and that table component will be standalone.
Yeah. So I have this, right? So maybe we have make this in here. I have home component, right? And this is standalone. The template, and I want to use a table here.
Okay.
And then I have some other component that I wrote that's like a table component.
Which is not a standalone. Is there a...
Oh, which is not standalone.
Yeah.
To be like, I have an ng module somewhere.
Yeah.
Like declarations, table component. Probably X the table component. And we'll call this the table module. So like this.
Okay.
Yeah, import the table module.
I thought
Yeah,
so
standalone components can import ng modules just as well as other standalone things they want.
So if I would have the page, which is like a routing component in ng module, and if I were to want to use the list component, which is standalone, and
so let's go the other way, right? So
yeah, there's the other way. Yeah, I thought that. Sorry.
Yeah. So let's say our home component here, right, is not standalone.
Yeah.
So this is our page. Right?
Sorry for messing up this.
That's fine.
Well, this is confusing for a lot of people.
Yeah. So here we have the homepage component, which has probably like router module for child, which is like at home component is homepage component. Cool. So we have a pretty standard route. For the homepage that we can easily load. And here, this guy imports. Yeah, he has imports already. He's going to need like common module because we're probably doing ngif before, and we want to use our table component. But you're saying our table component
which is standalone. Yeah.
Then we import it. All we need to do.
So yeah, okay. So we are able to import components too into imports. Okay, that's perfectly for me. Thank you.
Yeah, works in both directions, right? You can use standalone from non-standalone, or vice versa.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Okay.
Okay. Sonder and Kai have been nerding out over in the chat and have another question that's related to Pavel's question. Go ahead, Kai.
Yeah.
I said that was going to be the last question, but then Tito raised his hand. So y'all, Tito's question is going to be the last question because we're never going to get Alex to come back if we keep him here all day.
I'm having fun.
Okay. Well, I'll stay if you'll stay. I'm just, yeah. Okay.
I'm happy to hang out for a while. Yeah.
Go ahead, Kai.
Yeah, for those that didn't follow the chat, San and I were talking about if it is beginner friendly to actually touch the main TS file and add import providers from and stuff like that. So we said standalone components are easier for or beginner friendly, but if you have to touch the main TS in order to make app components standalone, then it might not be that easy. And Sander was like, hey, but you might not need it in case you're not doing anything fancy. But then I had to do it for router module for root. Sander, maybe you want to add something to that question because I'm not sure what's in your mind right now.
Yeah, I think there is a better way now for router module for root because I think that is going away, but I might be a little bit ahead of things. So
I think we are a little bit ahead of things.
I was afraid of that.
Yeah, so I think I kind of get the gist of what you're talking about. There are kind of, for the app component specifically, right, there are two things that we can talk about there. One is, can I make my application component standalone? And the other is, can I bootstrap without an ng module? Because those are separate operations. So if you just talk about making the app component standalone, right? So I have my components, as app components. I have my ng module. Declares the app component and bootstraps the app component. And then has imports, right? And here is where I have all of my so mixed dependencies, right, of app and app component. So I have my router module for root, have my HTTP client module, browser module, some weird reason includes common module. I have my shared module, whatever. So, and this is export class app module. And then somewhere I've written, in main.ts, right, we import the app module into platform browser strap module. And here's my template, whatever. So we can talk about converting the application component to standalone without removing the app module itself. So I can do this, right? I can say this component is now standalone, and I remove its declaration. Comment that out. App component is now standalone. As soon as I do this, I need to make sure that my template dependencies here are satisfied. So I need common module, probably have a router outlet in here. So router module is important, right? Shared module is a module that I'm using for components.
Can I just include, sorry to interrupt you, but can I just include router outlet there instead of router module?
I don't think it's a standalone directive yet, but it probably will be.
Okay.
So I think that's reasonable. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, because usually my app module, that's the only thing there. So
yeah, ngif maybe as well instead of common module, that's fine. This still functions as an application, right? I have my application component, which is standalone. And then I have my app module, which sets up all of my like services for my application, like the router, HTTP, etc. That bootstraps the app component. And that runs through Bootstrap module. Great. So you can make the application component standalone without needing to touch the main file, right? But if we want to get rid of this app module entirely, then we have to switch to this Bootstrap application operation. And that's where we kind of have to take the app module and Control X on the list of imports, call import providers from, and Control V into there. So that's the transformation that needs to happen. And now I can delete the app module entirely. And we've now switched Bootstrap to standalone. So there's kind of two steps to making the whole application standalone, right? Convert the application component itself, and then decompose the ng module.
That was very cool.
Yeah, the thing is you have to bootstrap your application anyhow. So the difference is a couple of things move from the app module to the main.ts. And I think they should be in the main.ts because those define how your application is booting, which makes sense in a standalone world. Makes more sense to me anyway, but that might be personal.
One of the conversations that's still ongoing and probably RFCs that will come in the future is like, what does a standalone application look like? So do we want this in main.ts? Or do we want like maybe imports here? And then imports is something that you export from like an app.ts. And then maybe we have providers here as a separate thing. So there's some question of like, how much do we put in main.ts? Do we have other files running around? Where does the route configuration go? Without an ng module for that.
Yeah, I think we need a couple of updated best practices for this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But it's all debatable.
And this is one of those cases where we're really excited to do the developer preview because we want to see what patterns people start using when they're actually using these APIs. And then we can look at like, okay, these, they have these benefits, these drawbacks. Let's decide what the standard should be.
That's why I really like this format, because I think so many developers are going to kind of hesitate and just kind of hang back to see what everybody else is doing. But we get to jump in and participate. That's nice. Okay, we do have another question up. Tito has a question.
Yeah, so Alex, is it okay to look at the standalone component as a mirror of the app module itself, as in with the minimal import of dependencies? Is it like a mirror of the app module itself, as in, since you could like just input everything here?
The app component?
Yeah, like
Are you talking about like the app group, Tito?
Yeah, I'm talking about the standalone component. Is it like, could you like look at it as a mirror of the app component itself?
No, don't do that. You're talking about something like this, right? Where I like make my app component just kind of like import the thing that my app module used to. It will not work. If you try to do import providers from here, you will find that TypeScript will yell at you. This is not allowed. The app component, right, has a very different life cycle for its providers than the application itself. These are conceptually different things. And so with standalone, you really need to start thinking about it as the component imports the things that the component wants to use in its template. Only directives, other components, pipes, etc. The application really is configuring the environment in which all of your components live. So that is all of the services, HTTP, router, browser, location stuff, etc.
If you can put all those things in the main TS.
Yes, or whatever structure we come up with for it, but they do not belong in the component import.
Okay, thank you.
It can be in the providers there, though.
Some things can be provided by the this doesn't work, right? If you say like providers here, import providers from, also won't work. It's entirely possible, right, in an application to have components that are in the app but are not children of the app component. A common example of this is if you have some kind of like modal dialog host component that is created by a library behind the scenes. Often it is created a separate root component in the application, not a child of the app component, so it doesn't have the same, it doesn't get its dependencies from the application.
Alex, it might be because I'm getting tired and my brain is a little fried, but can you fix it so that it's back the way, because it was working and then you broke it so that you could show him how not to do it. But we're going to be relying on these notes later because we want to keep these.
Yep, I'll just remove those parts.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'm afraid they're gonna keep asking questions forever, but I do want to kind of wrap it up and give. And nobody has hands up right now, so this is a very good time, I think, to wrap it up. Do you have final thoughts, Alex, that you would like to leave us with?
Just, I would say, like, try it out. If you run into problems or questions, like, open issues, because we're very much looking for feedback on this stuff. If you find an interesting pattern that, like, hey, I structured my application in this way and it was really clean, and my other developers understood it easily, love to hear about that. Same with the opposite. If you structure it some way and like everyone says this is the most confusing thing in the world, also we want to know about that.
Okay, Sonder.
Yeah, I really love the new inject because it decouples injecting stuff from the component into functions you are calling from the component, which is really nice. I think it needs to be taught carefully, because the more advanced people can take use of this and understand what they are doing. At the same time, I think there is a massive food gun there, because people will go wild and injecting boatloads of stuff everywhere, which is a bad idea, in my opinion. But perhaps you can highlight the best use of the inject function now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So inject has actually been in Angular for a long time. It was part of the original tree shakeable providers API for inject tokens, injection tokens, and
don't you hide it away? It's now in the open.
Well, it's been in the public API since like Angular 8 or 7 or something like that. But for a long time, there was kind of a problem where inject would not work in components. And as part of doing the standalone stuff and talking about standalone provider functions and how libraries were going to design API that didn't use ng modules for certain cases, one of the things we did was say, well, let's like fix this long-standing problem with inject so that it can be used in the component context. And so I actually did this PR like during the first couple weeks of RC, where we were talking about some of these use cases and realized, oh yeah, if we fix this like low priority bug, then some of these APIs will get a little prettier. And we submitted that, and everyone lost their minds. This turned into like one of the flagship features of V14 for a lot of the more advanced kind of library authors and other developers. But today, dependency injection works like this, right? Where I have, let's make the directive, my directive, and I have a constructor. And I have arguments. So, dep is of type dependency, other service, etc. And this is how I specify dependencies. And there's a couple of downsides to this. Downside number one, we're using types to refer to values. And this is kind of a weird TypeScript quirk, but this is something that I could have gotten by saying import type dependency. And this is a signal to the IDE and to everything else that like, I only need this in a type sense. And when you read this code, it's clear that like, oh yeah, dependency here is, the first argument to this constructor. Just there's no real runtime reference to something here. But it turns out that's not the case, because under the hood, Angular compiles this to a factory function that basically says new MITRE inject dependency, inject other service. It's more complicated than this, but like pseudocode wise, this is what's happening. So we convert from a type reference to a real value reference. And that is an inherently risky thing to do in TypeScript. You can have types which aren't values. You can refer to types in weird ways that aren't values. Another problem is it's hard to specify metadata configuration here. So instead, we have to rely on kind of decorators that we can add, optional, skip self, right, etc. So we're using decorators. Decorators and parameters aren't part of the TC39 decorator spec. So these things are not actually in the new spec for decorators that's being adopted by the language. Types will probably continue to support them, but we try in Angular to be aligned with the direction the language is actually going. And so these are kind of weird in that sense. Another problem here is add inject, right? If I have an injection token that I pass through add inject here, there's actually no relationship between the at inject and type of thing that gets injected. Same with optional, I think. What I mean by that is this token has some idea of what type of value it'll produce, but nothing is actually validating that the parameter you're expecting is of the same type. So inject is kind of a very type unsafe API in that sense. The at inject, sorry. And kind of a final problem is it makes the BI requirements of a class part of its public signature. And it's even kind of worse than that. It requires repeating that signature in derived classes. So it behaves in very strange ways with types. It's not aligned with the way the language works or the direction the language is going. And it has this awkwardness about it when it comes to dependencies and inheritance. And this means that libraries like the Angular CDK, which are trying to provide base classes for you to build your own things like menus and tables have to be very careful about what they inject and changing the set of things that they inject, because it's a public API change to require a new dependency. It changes the constructor, which means the person who's inheriting from that class and calling super has to evolve as well. So if I write, you know, class child extends MyDirt, right? If I have a constructor here, I can't just add logic, right? Or have my own constructors, right? Or additional dependencies. I have to call super, and I have to pass everything that my parent required, right? And then I like end up copy pasting this signature and putting it here just so that I can do that. And then I can inject my own stuff on top of that. And then if this library changes, then it's a breaking change to add a new dependency here, because then I have to add it here and copy it into here. And this is just a really awkward way to deal with dependencies in an API. Many times when you depend on something, you want it to be kind of a private thing. You know, we don't necessarily need to expose to the child here that we're like using some service. So the best way to use inject, I think, right now is if you're writing these kinds of shared things, instead of using constructor injection, you can just say dep is inject dependency and use it in the initializer. This is using an actual value to refer to the thing to inject instead of the type. Much better, right? Resolves this problem. It's not using decorators anymore, so it resolves the next two. We're not reliant on TC39 adding parameter decorators back. If you want to inject an injection token here, inject signature knows what type you're going to get out of this. So it's perfectly type safe. If you add, and this is not the current API, but it will be, if you add an optional flag, you will get an or null result type there. Or you can say like a default value or something like that. And stops you from from doing those things. And finally, this is not a part of the signature of this function, right? This can be pretty private. So I can extend from this thing and not worry about needing to kind of copy paste a whole bunch of its injection operations. So it's kind of the best of all worlds when it comes to this.
Also, you can use it in a function that you use on a property decorator. On a property, not on a decorator.
Yeah, so we've been exploring with NGRX, for example, like inject store operations or something like that, where you can have some configuration here, and this function can internally call inject and return, you know, an object that's configured in the way that you want it to be.
Yeah, it takes care of injecting NGRX and everything that needs for this for this store, so you don't have to put all this stuff into your constructor. Which makes a really nice API if you are building a library that uses things like that.
Yep.
This conversation has been so cool. I know I bugged you, but I'm not even sorry. I'm not even sorry, because this is just the coolest conversation. And I hope you come back very often. You're probably my favorite guest of everybody. You really explain things. Oh, speaking of which, please, before we forget, will you please put the link for these notes in our chat? And if someone can please grab that link, and also the link above the one that was for the standalone guide, and put both of those in the comments under our event, it would be very appreciated. And while you're doing that, I want to take a minute one more time to thank AG Grid for helping us keep Angular Nation up and running. And also, I want to, you guys know the drill. We have a tradition on Angular Nation. Everybody come off mute and help me thank our guests.
Thank you,
Thank
Alex.
you. Thanks,
Alex.
Thank you.
Alex.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Just
Thank
knowledge
you.
field.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, until next time.
We love
Have a
having
great
you.
evening.